Well, you have to turn the light off. Yeah. And Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Hail Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Tyrant Martyrs,
Pray for us.
Saint Thomas Aquinas,
Pray for us.
Saint Augustine,
Pray for us.
and Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. All right, so we're continuing to move through the Gorgias, and today we're going to be going over the conversation that Polus has with Plato. So the first part we went through was Socrates, questioning Gorgias and trying to figure out the nature of rhetoric, and then Socrates points out that Gorgias has come into a contradiction in his definition of rhetoric. He says that rhetoric is the art of persuading people regarding the just and the unjust. And so if you know rhetoric, then you would have to know about what's just and unjust. However, then Gorgias admits that some of his students who learn rhetoric actually don't know what justice is. And so then you're left with, well, how is rhetoric the art of persuading regarding the just and the unjust if it doesn't actually know what justice is? And so Polus then begins to question Socrates, to try to get at what it is that Socrates means by all these positions. And from this, we get a couple distinctions. Remember, that's always the work of the philosophers, to make distinctions between an art and an experience, or art and flattery. And he says that what makes an art is that you can explain the reasons for its use. An art has a purpose to it. All right, and it's a good purpose, and you can rationally explain that. An experience or flattery cannot provide reasons for their existence. Now we're dealing with Plato, right? You could say that, well, experiences are flatteries, such as cookery, which is another way of saying cooking. All right, you can say there's a reason for why cooking exists, to make food taste good. But for Plato, if you don't have a good reason for a thing existing, you actually have no reason for it to exist at all. And Plato can see no good reason for why you would have the experience or the flattery of cooking or tiring referring to dressing up. That would also include makeup and such. So, what are some of the arts that Socrates referred to? Does anyone remember? He makes like these fourfold distinctions of arts. 2 relate to the body and 2 relate to the soul. Fiona? Music is... no, he does not refer to music in this context. Michael?
Medicine?
Medicine's one of them. All right, so there's 4 arts. And one is medicine. Very good. Nick, did you have another one?
Like carpentry?
No, he does not refer to carpentry as an art in the Gorgias. Spencer?
I have 2 of them. Is one of them love and one of them beauty?
No. Those aren't art. Those come in. Beauty comes in when he starts talking about what is good and useful. That is later in the dialogue, but not in this circumstance we're talking about. Louisa? Arithmetic, he does believe it's an art, okay, but we're talking about the arts that relate to the body. 2 relate to the body, and then 2 relate to the soul. And they kind of parallel each other. So aside from medicine, you also have gymnastics. All right, and these two arts relate to the body. Gymnastics, of course, what that does is it is a part of creating a healthy body. Making the body beautiful / healthy. All right, so having a fit body, a body that does gymnastics is one that can, it can wrestle, it can run. It's not injured, it's not slothful, it's able to function as it should. And then medicine restores health when it's lost. All right, so gymnastics is how you get your body in shape and healthy, and then if you ever lose that health, medicine can help you regain it. All right, so you get the cold and you're no longer able to be as gymnastic as you were before, that you then go to medicine to restore the body. All right, then there's the two arts that relate to the soul are legislation. All right, that's the art of lawmaking, of making good laws, and justice. All right, and these parallel the arts associated with the body. So just as gymnastics kind of gets your body in shape and it's what maintains it being in good shape, having good laws keeps a soul virtuous or keeps it just. You have just laws that it then obeys. And if your soul becomes sick, okay, you stray from justice, then receiving justice at the hand of a judge, some kind of corrective punishment, restores the lost justice. All right, so receiving justice at the hand of a judge it puts you back into right standing with society once you serve your time, so to speak. All right, so each of these arts has a counterfeit that's opposed to them. All right, so contrasted to gymnastics is not the art, but the experience, Socrates would call it, or the flattery of hiring. Okay, and does anyone remember what's opposed to cooking? I'm sorry, I just said it. What's opposed to medicine? It's cookery, cooking. Do with the body, okay, and this is why. So tiring is a way of wearing baggy clothes that makes it look like you have a decent, respectable physique, but in reality, you do not have an athletic body. But the clothes kind of hide that up, and if you learn how to wear belts just right and really suck in that gut, then you give off that appearance of being healthy, of having a healthy body, but you actually don't. You're just trying to flatter yourself. So gymnastics, it's false health is being presented. And then cookery is food that tastes good, but it's not actually healthy for you. All right. What robs us of health. All right. So, the person who cooks up cakes knows how to entice children to eat food. Okay, but the children don't need cakes. The children need broccoli, they need carrots, they need to eat their lettuce, etc. Then on the side of the soul, the flatteries that mimic legislation, Socrates calls sophistry. And the flattery to justice is rhetoric. Sophistry is putting on the appearance of having wisdom when you legislate to create a law, right? Coming up with policies. You can convince people to make a policy and get a law pushed through, but is it actually a good law? Well, no, not necessarily. If it was a good law, then you'd be practicing legislation, Plato would say. And then with rhetoric, used in a court of law to persuade people regarding what's just and unjust, you as a rhetorical lawyer could maybe convince someone to be let off the hook for a crime they committed when they really should be punished, or you could use your rhetoric to inflict punishments on someone who actually is innocent and doesn't deserve, say, the death penalty, but then they get it anyway, which is what happens to Socrates at the end of his life. So bad laws that you can make them, push them through, and then using persuasion within the courts. All right, so after Socrates gives his long explanation of art as opposed to flattery, they shift to the topic of power. Yes, Spencer, sorry.
Couldn't you use rhetoric even if a person is guilty, though?
Yes, we'll get to that at the end, because at the end of the dialogue, it actually concludes with Socrates using rhetoric. So rhetoric is a tool. Sophistry is a tool. Just like, say your mom's a good cook. It doesn't mean she's evil, right? And just because you know how to wear clothes properly doesn't make you intrinsically evil, right? But these things, when they're used with, say, gymnastics, or if you know how to work actual nutrition into your food and then present it as tasty, well, then that's awesome, okay? So you can also use rhetoric to promote the good. But in that instance, what you're actually practicing is justice, and you can pull rhetoric out as like a toolbox to then apply it.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Which is why we actually teach rhetoric at the school last year, right? It's not like we're trying to get people to be horrible human beings. But yeah, that's addressed by Plato at the end of the dialogue. Okay, but so they shift the topic of power, because Socrates talks about how rhetoric is nothing but the use of power to get people condemned. And Polus says, well, that's awesome, right? That's what I want. I want to have that type of power to get people condemned in courts. And that's to be desired. So they then proceed through the following parts of the dialogue. So Polus maintains that rhetoricians have the most power because they can kill people and get away with it. And Socrates then asks Polus, he tells him that he thinks that they're the least powerful people. And the reason he says rhetoricians have the least amount of power is because they do what they think is best. Which Polus is kind of confused about. Well, what do you mean? If they do what they think is best, then that is actually why I'm saying they're powerful. And Socrates says, no, for that reason, they're actually the least powerful people, and they're not to be envied at all. So for as part of the illustration of this is, all right, if a fool was allowed to do what he thought best as a fool, would that actually be good for him? For a foolish man to go out and do what he thinks is best? No, that would be bad, right? And that's kind of where Socrates is going with this, is that the rhetoricians who actually don't know about justice, but they're given this tool to then go around and persuade people about what is just, is like Detective Clouseau in the Pink Panther, right? You've given this great power to essentially an idiot, and they're not to be trusted with it. And that's a thing that you don't want to desire or be envious of. All right, so they also proceed with the argument in this way. When men drink medicine, do they drink medicine for the sake of medicine, or for the sake of health? Which is it? Spencer.
For the sake of health.
For the sake of the health. All right, so we do neutral things as well for the sake of other goods, such as walking, right? You don't go for walks. I mean, people do nowadays, they go for walks for the sake of walks. But like when you're going to your class and you have to walk, you're not walking for the sake of walking, but to reach some other good, namely arriving to class on time. Yes? All right, then you're following along just with the dialogue. All right, so we don't will, Socrates would say, we don't will to do the neutral thing, the walking, but we will the good that we're trying to achieve. We're willing to get to class on time. And so we don't will what is evil. It's impossible to will something evil, only what is good. Tyrants, when they kill, they do what seems best. But if what he does not actually bring about the good, okay, but he's doing what he wills, and he's actually bringing about evil, then he's actually not doing what he wills, because all people will and desire what is good. All right, they want to get what's best for them. But if you're allowed to just exercise your power and you don't get what's good, you actually inflict evil and harm upon yourself, then you are the most powerless person, because you're not capable of actually obtaining what it is that you want. All right, so for Plato, someone who goes out and practices injustice, they're making their soul sick. All right, that's a deficiency that they're experiencing, and they're inflicting that harm upon themselves. And they don't realize it, though. So Socrates says we should pity those who act unjustly and are in control. And he also mentions that it's better to die an unjust death than to be an unjust executioner. It is better, though, to die justly than to die unjustly. So Socrates throws up for Polus this kind of scale of evils that are to be avoided. Evils to be avoided. Number one, being the worst, is doing injustice. Because if you are able to do acts of injustice and you're a tyrant and you can get away with it, well, then there's no one who can cure you of that injustice, and you carry around that illness in your soul forever. The second worst evil is to suffer justice. Oh, yes, yeah. Suffer justice, all right? So that this justice that you suffer is kind of like a corrective medicine for the soul, as Socrates understands it, as he's explaining it to Polus. Next, the next evil is to suffer unjustly. All right, Socrates would still rather suffer at the hands of a tyrant and be innocent than to have the evil in his soul to begin with and then correct it. So if you had to choose between the two, you'd rather have his head chopped off by some dictator than be a criminal and have his head chopped off by the state for a just cause. And then fourth is to administer justice. All right, and administering justice, it's not evil in and of itself. It actually is a good thing, but it's still not to be envied. All right, to get my Lord of the Rings reference in for the day, think of Gandalf talking to Frodo in the Mines of Moria. All right, he tells Frodo, when Frodo talks about wishing Bilbo had cut Gollum's throat and just killed the evil creature. Gandalf says, "Don't be so hasty to deal out death and judgment." All right, to have that kind of power is a huge responsibility. Right, working in Spider-Man references as well. But so have that power is a huge responsibility. It's not something to be envied, because if you're the one who has that and you misstep, All right, well, now you have the potency to be the guy who is in possession of the worst evil. All right, and it's a lot of pressure. That's better to just go without in your life. So this is Socrates' way of seeing. This is Socrates' explanation of his reasoning behind, why rhetoricians are, flattery. It's not actually anything. It's not as worthwhile as, say, learning about justice itself. Polus attempts to refute Socrates by telling the story of Archelaus, the tyrant, who was a bastard son. He then, I believe he killed his dad, and then I think he killed his mom too. He killed his brother, and he killed everyone else who had a right to the throne, and then he grew to be powerful. And Polus says, "You're telling me, Socrates, you don't want to be that guy?" All right, what Polus is doing is an example of rhetoric. He's drawing in this outside example. He's telling a story, and then he ends the story not by actually making any concrete claim, but then just asking what we call a rhetorical question to Socrates, a question that's not supposed to be answered, is how can you possibly hold your position given this individual case, this event that happened? All right, and so, he's like, do you think Archelaus is unhappy? And Socrates responds, well, I've never met the guy. So how would I know? And then Polus says, well, according to what you've reasoned out, he should be unhappy. And Socrates says, you're right. He probably is the most miserable man on earth. And that just frustrates Polus. So they also get into the next point that Socrates brings up is that those who go unpunished are miserable, and those who are unpunished are less miserable. And Polus begins to laugh at Socrates and just thinks that's a ridiculous position to hold, which is another example of rhetoric. Scoffing at your opponent is not practicing dialectic. That does not lead the two people in dialogue to truth, okay? But that's a way to make your opponent look bad, essentially, all right? So in this dialogue, you get Plato is specifically pointing out examples of rhetoric and contrasting them constantly with the art of dialectic, the art of actually trying to arrive at truth. So the next thesis that they move on to, that Socrates has to defend, is that suffering is worse than doing injustice. Or, sorry, this is Polus's position. All right, suffering is worse than doing injustice. And this is how Socrates approaches this claim to undercut his argument. So Socrates asks them, okay, Polus, do you think that suffering is worse than doing injustice? I think the opposite. Let me ask you this. What is more disgraceful? Is it more disgraceful to be the one suffering or to be the one performing the act of injustice? Spencer.
The one to be performing the act of injustice.
Right, the one who's doing the unjust act is the one who's more disgraceful. It's more disgraceful to be a Nazi guard in a concentration camp than it is to be the Jew suffering in the camp. Okay, the one doing the evil is the one who bears the more disgrace. And so, when it comes to evil, Socrates asks him, is not the honorable, let's collect my thoughts here. That which is good and the dishonorable is that which is evil. All right, so that's one way that he starts to point to Polus that, no, look, to be the one doing the injustice is the more dishonorable, and that is what you associate with evil, whereas what's honorable is what's good. So clearly, at least he's getting Polus to see that doing injustice, all right, being a tyrant, is evil, and they're starting to make that step, even though Polis might still think it's a worse evil to have to suffer at the hands of the tyrant than to necessarily be the tyrant. So now Spencer is the part of the dialogue where they start talking about like the beautiful and the good. So Socrates and Polis come to the agreement that the definition of what is good is the useful, the beautiful, the pleasant, and the honorable. Things which possess these qualities are what we call good. And the measure of a thing's beauty for Plato it lies in the combination of what is useful and pleasurable. All right, and insofar as those two things meet, that's where you find beauty. All right, so in the this work of art, all right, we describe that as beautiful, right? How, in the Platonic sense of usefulness and pleasure, would you explain this to be beautiful? As a bringing together of the useful and the pleasant. Michael?
From I'm assuming that it's from like a really early time. So by the art, by people looking at the art, it's telling them the story because they really didn't read the books. So they're learning about the stories that it's telling.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't even thinking about that, but that's really good. So this kind of art serves a useful function in educating, right? That's one usefulness it brings about. So that's the useful side. Spencer?
Never mind.
Okay. It's a ceiling, by the way. Krisha?
I mean, the pleasing side could be just that it looks good.
Yeah, that's the pleasing side, all right? It catches the eye, all right? It's very easy on the eyes, actually, and there's all these optical illusions that make it look really nice, all right? And then, so you have the usefulness of the storytelling, and it's pleasing to look at. That's beautiful. Also, it's a ceiling, so it does the job of shelter as well. And so that adds to its beauty, right? And you can even talk about how it's like, well, it's a ceiling, but it's actually a gateway open up looking at heaven, and then there's more thought behind it, as with like the story and the pleasantry of it. All right, so that, I mean, that's not the only way to talk about beauty, but that's the angle that Plato's coming at, right? You have the usefulness, you have the pleasantness. Plato would say, wow, that's beautiful. So now moving on to evil. Evil is a combination of what's painful, what's ugly, the thing's uselessness, all right, and also dishonor. And so Polis says, all right, when it comes to doing injustice, yes, you can have more of the dishonor associated with doing the act of injustice. And Socrates then points out that if it's more disgraceful to do evil, then it has to have either more pain or more evil associated with it. All right, since these things all hang together in the definition of evil. Now, is it going to have more pain or evil if it's going to be more, disgraceful to do something, to act unjustly? What are you going to experience more of? Spencer?
Evil.
Well, yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel bad to be a tyrant.
Well, I mean,
This is what's tripping up Polis the whole time, is that it doesn't feel bad to be a tyrant.
well, it would be more evil, but it doesn't have to be physical pain. It could be mental pain, or it could be some sort of pain to your psyche, not as much as your body,
Okay.
your physical body. It doesn't have to be like you broke your leg, you're in pain. It could be like, I just killed my family, I'm in pain.
Okay, yes. And so even like that understanding of the world as you're like talking about is, you kind of like thank Plato for making all these different distinctions as a thought philosophy moving forward. Chloe, go ahead and then I'll.
I was just gonna ask, like, with Spencer's like guilt, like, is that what he's like asking?
Okay,
With pain?
So yeah, pain is on the level of what's physical, what they're talking about.
Okay.
Bodily pain. All right, so like for Plato, if you fell and broke your leg, part of the evil of breaking your leg is actually like you're feeling the broken bone. Okay, but you don't necessarily, it's not dishonorable to break your leg.
It just
Unless
happens
it's
sometimes.
like overtime in a soccer game and you fall on your face when you could have kicked the winning goal and then you broke your leg. Then you have dishonor on top of it. But that's not necessarily associated with just the leg being broken. The dishonor is when you even said the word psyche, which is Greek for soul, right? And so that's the evil that is inflicting the soul. That what you feel in the psyche is the manifestation of the evil, whereas like walking on a broken leg is the manifestation of the physical evil you're dealing with. The guilt you carry is the mental, it's the spiritual manifestation of the evil that is being carried. All right, so because what's dishonorable is the greater evil, no one should actually prefer to do injustice rather than suffering it, because no one actually prefers evil over a good. So those who practice justice, they're the ones who do what they want, right? Because the one who's just is what's striving for the honorable, and that is the good. And so the person who's doing justice is striving for the good. When someone punishes justly, then the one suffering also suffers justly, and that is to be desirable, especially if you're someone who has that kind of spiritual illness, right? The dishonor that you need remedied. The person suffers honorably if they're being punished justly, which means that the person who's suffering honorably is suffering what's good. And so they actually don't have an evil. It's better to be punished, caught and punished, and to suffer honorably and to suffer some kind of good. Because that way you're actually possessing a good, not an evil. Socrates then poses Polus another question. What's more disgraceful? Injustice? Between these three things. Injustice, poverty, or sickness. Polus affirms that injustice is the more disgraceful. All right, poverty and sickness are both more painful, you can say. Poverty and sickness are also useless or not beneficial. And so because you eliminate those qualities, you're left with the disgraceful, actually being an evil. All right, whereas you could call these an evil, right? But why is poverty an evil? What do people in poverty have a hard time doing? It's evil because, what's that?
Not very useful.
Yeah, it's not useful. You can't do things like buy food or own a shelter, all right? So it's like a crime against usefulness. And whereas sickness is evil because it's a crime against, or not a crime, but it's, it is painful. when your body's not feeling well. So to cure the unjust, you take them to judges. The art of justice relieves the greatest evil. So Socrates holds justice to be the greatest art because it gets rid of the greatest evil. If punishment is not pleasant, it still maintains the fact is useful. So punishment you can talk about in two ways. It's evil because it causes pain, but then the usefulness is a higher good than, say, pleasure. All right, and so because you have that higher good, it outweighs the evil of the pain. And Plato and Socrates together, they kind of define happiness is not possessing evils, the absence of an evil. The happiest man is the one who never had to be healed of any ailments, the one who's never been sick, who's never been poor, okay, and he's never been unjust. The next happiest man is the one who's been cured of those things. And then the one who is the most unhappy is the one who has never been cured. Continue to read the dialogue for tomorrow. Yes, Spencer.
So